Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we work to unlock and analyze and investigate the amazing, the epic, the awesome power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in our everyday lives. I'm Gorv.
And I'm Kevin.
Kev, I'm back home in Toronto in my childhood bedroom, and I recently was listening to Armchair Expert with Adam Grant. He did 3 amazing episodes. I'm listening to it as a trilogy, and he talked about this concept of maximizer versus satisfizer. This term, maximizer versus satisfizer, was originated by Herbert Simon, a Nobel laureate in economics and a cognitive psychologist. He coined the term satisficing in 1950s. So it's this idea that satisficers strive for good enough, like what's going to get me to tomorrow, what's going to keep me as much money as I need next. While maximizers look for the absolute best. How do I make sure I go to the best restaurant? How do I make sure I went to the best school? So you can even hear as I speak the anxiety in it. And it's funny because I struggle with so many maximizer tendencies. And I think good enough is really hard for me. You know, it's a story of what does good enough mean, right? Good enough almost feels like a cop out. And again, we are constantly trying to build the world for maximizers, right? That's where Google Maps reviews came from. And some people are good with like, what's this best for me in this moment? Some people are like, what's the highest rated thing?
I think both lifestyles are pretty subjective points of view. And to your point on what's good enough, what is even good sometimes? And sometimes our definition of good is also very subjective. It's a designed goalpost or standard that are defined that people buy in. And when you get enough people to buy in on that story of, oh, this is good, that's how you can build a foundation to say what's better, what's the best, what can I maximize. This is part of the reason I've been reading Don Quixote as well.
You've been reading it for what? How long have you been reading it?
It's
2
got
weeks? What?
3 years,
3
I want to
years.
say.
The amount of trips we've gone in where Kevin has Don Quixote and he's sitting on a porch reading Don Quixote.
It's reading this book as long of a journey as the story itself, is what I have to say. But you might remember that I said this to you once. I like the story because Don Quixote, he's just a man trying to reach his goal. Because I think it really depicts the story of everyone, even though supposedly this is a madman doing crazy things. But aren't we all chasing some kind of fable? Is the maximization or the satisfaction we're chasing objectively there, or are they all kind of made up that are stories we can buy into? So
It's all
fascinating
made
concept.
up. It's all made up. And you know, this thing about satisfizer versus maximize as well. No one is one thing, right? Well, I think I have very extreme maximizing tendencies in most things. There's stuff where I'm satisfying. It's highly personal and it's a spectrum, right? Sometimes you lean more this way or that way. So it's extremely complex. But by taking this lens and looking at these good enough satisfying versus maximizing stories, you can ask yourself, should I be maximizing this? Is it worth my time to be maximizing? Or is good enough fine here? For me, I romanticize satisficing for sure because I'm such a maximizer and I can see how it affects the stories I tell myself. Where sometimes I have to be like, you're doing the best you can, you're doing the best you can, you're okay. My therapist once said to me, Kevin, you know this, my therapist once said to me, your mind sounds exhausting. And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you can, besides your autobiography, something else you can do authorship-wise is separate quote books. That's just my therapist says.
My therapist says, we love our quote books. Here's a quote from Marilyn Monroe before we move on. Never regret anything because at one time it was exactly what you wanted. And speaking of looking back, Kev, we have something kind of interesting and special for today.
Yes, Gaurav. This is going to be a special episode where we rewind on a great conversation with the fascinating storyteller all the way back in season 3. Craig Thompson, who is a comic book artist. And if you are into comic books, you might have heard of Blankets.
Blankets is in every comic book store. It is one of the most iconic graphic novels ever made, period. It is something that explores the depth and the expansion of what's possible in comic book form. This is a unique medium. There are stories you can tell in this medium that you can't tell with books or movies or TVs.
Yeah, but how we got connected is actually a really interesting story as well, because I actually discovered one of Craig's new comic series, Ginseng Roots, back in 2022, I want to say. It's around the time when he started this comic book series, almost as a sequel to his life story in Blankets. Ginseng Roots is about Craig's upbringing, working in Wisconsin, doing farm work as little boys with his brother. And for me, born and raised in China, ginseng is one of these herbal plants that are very well known in Chinese medicine. And I stumbled upon his 11th issue at the time, which documented his journey in Northeastern China. It's also about the foundation of the United States, the US China trade relationship between the two largest world economies, all tied to this interesting story that you otherwise wouldn't have thought much about. And a little earlier this year, Craig has published Ginseng Roots in the graphic novel format. It is a beautiful design, and it has all the amazing arts and the entire series combined in here. And we're very lucky to have received a few copies of this graphic novel. And so we thought it was a great time for us to revisit this story, this conversation with Craig as well.
Yeah, and this is the first time it's in video. So
Yep.
if you've listened to this before, this is definitely a fun time to revisit it because we are going back, watching an episode that we never intended to hit video.
Yep. So without further ado, let's get back to 2 years ago with Craig.
Lin suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gorilla and Kevin.
And to start off our conversation, Craig, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
All right, my name is Craig Thompson. I'm a graphic novelist. I feel like that term is kind of universal now. People suddenly know what a graphic novel is, but say 20 years ago, that wasn't pretty much a mainstream terminology. People were very confused if you brought up that term. But basically, I do book-length comic books. Until recently, I've only done like 300, 400, 700 page graphic novels. And more recently, I'm doing a serialized comic book for the first time. I grew up in middle of nowhere, rural Midwest of America in Wisconsin, and pretty isolated upbringing. And really, it's this career in comics that's really extended my boundaries and my relationship with the world and kind of got me out of the trappings of a small town.
I think you've built your career in this kind of graphic, autobiographical genre of graphic novels, right? It's a genre that people don't often think about immediately with comics because it's the medium versus genre debate, right? When comic books is a medium, it's an art form. It has so much room for so many amazing genres, like what you've worked in. So tell us a little bit about why the autobiographical kind of genre made sense for you. That's really hard in this space because people make comic books, that's for kids, or comic books, that's superheroes, right? When I'm like, well, you just saw a movie, how is words with art less like intellectually stimulating than that? But tell us about getting that book sold and the success it had.
So with Blankets, that was a totally different era. Again, came out 20 years ago, and the graphic novels really wasn't established as a medium yet. Of course, there had been Mouse, which to me, by Art Spiegelman, is still kind of the greatest graphic novel of all time. But there was also Chris Ware's Jimmy Corrigan had come out in the year 2000. That was 3 years before Blankets. But that was serialized. So there wasn't this sort of thing of just all in one swoop putting out a huge 500-page comic book. But I was working with a really small publisher here in Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm living now, and I've lived most of my career. And it was just two guys, small company, and they were doing indie comics, which is another niche within the niche of comics. And and they didn't have any money or anything. My advance for blankets was about $300 to do a 500-page book. So that's not what I was paying the bills with. On the other hand, they weren't really controlling. They kind of gave me free reign to do whatever I wanted. I knew that per my contract, well, I just have to deliver a book and they're going to have to publish it. So I felt like a little, privileged to be like, well, okay, so it doesn't matter if it's a 100-page book or a 500-page book, they're going to have to publish it.
Blankets, of course, is huge. It's been on all these lists. It's known in the industry. I think you can pick it up in honestly any comic book store at this point. What was that experience like when you're like, oh, this is catching on, and it's something so deeply personal? What was that experience like for you?
It changed everything. I still don't think I've really recovered from that whole experience. I was like a working class kid. I hadn't gone to college. I really didn't have any real life experience. I was quite naive and sheltered. I thought the book would never find an audience. I was like, well, even in the US, are people that grew up in urban centers going to relate to this super isolated rural upbringing? People who grew up in secular households, are they going to be able to relate to all these religious themes? I felt like it was itself very niche because it was about this very specific sheltered childhood. But I think there ended up being all these universal themes around first love, around family, sibling dynamics, faith and or falling from faith. Those themes proved to be universal around the world. I would say the number one readership of blankets is probably India, or maybe of my books in general. And then after that, it's a debate, but I've had great success traveling in the Middle East, South Korea, huge blankets, like devoted fan base there. So yeah, those themes, I guess what they say is like when you're specific, when you try to make it as specific as possible, it becomes more universal.
That's so important too about the comic book industry. I think this is one of the things I love about this industry is I've read so many cool niche stories. There's these stories that would not have been made into movies, would not have been made into TV shows because there's huge risks, right, to make movies, TV shows. With comic books, there's a lot less risk to get these stories told, and that's how we had so much amazing stuff in the non-superhero genre. Like Image puts out so many cool things. All these independent creators. You mentioned Mouse, which is one of the most iconic graphic novels of all time, your work. And it's one of the beautiful things about this industry is that you can try things and you can get niche and you can learn that, people don't have to have gone through the exact same experience, or this doesn't have to be based on IP we've heard for the last 70 years for it to find an audience. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of this industry.
Yeah, and you mentioning that, and also the fact that both of you live in Los Angeles reminds me of all the sort of Hollywood meetings I've taken with multiple studios, really big names, directors, producers. And a thing that I hear a lot from those people, because I always feel very humbled in the presence of someone who's made some epic movie. And then they sort of flip it on its head and say, like, no, we have a lot of respect for you because what you did as just one person. We're just part of a team of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. So we're not going to take the credit for that movie because we know we have a whole army of people behind us. Whereas like what you do is like one person, very little resources, a lot of time, that's the main resource, and some hand pain.
Going back to blankets a little bit, because it's been 20 years since the story came out and be read around the world. What's that experience like for you, knowing that the story has been so popular for such a long time, and looking back, are there any parts of the story where you will take a look at how you told it back then and feel like you might have told it differently now?
Definitely. I think every book is just sort of like a little bookmark in that moment in my life. Like I couldn't write any one of my books at a different time. It'd be very strange to write a book like Blankets now as an almost 50-year-old man. It'd be almost creepy, I think. It'd be like looking back on a high school romance and making a book about it. But it was an appropriate thing to be doing at age 23 when I was still sort of, my heart was still caught up in some of those things. Working on a project, I can only see the flaws. The page I'm working on that day is the page I hate the most. Usually like a week later, I can look at that page and be like, it's okay. The flaws are okay. It's out of my control now. And that experience increases as time goes by. So once a book is in print, it really feels like it's been born. It's its own entity. It's no longer a physical part of me. And really, it does have a life of its own, the way a child might. You don't necessarily blame a parent for how, well, you do blame a parent for how the child turns out, but certain elements that are outside of a parent's control. And blankets might be the little golden child in my family. But it's different from me at this point. I'm a different person. I couldn't write that book. There are elements that I envy a lot, where I look back and I'm like, oh, I had like a sort of creative purity at that age, So I was 23, 25, so full of like this creative energy and youth. And I can see that in the pages. So I'm grateful for that. So it sort of is a timestamp on who I was as an author and person at that time. And then there's other elements that I'm sure are just completely cringy to me. But are they cringy for the right reason? Are they just cringy because I'm more of a cynical adult at this point? Who knows?
Was there ever the temptation to do spin-offs or sequels or get into some of those side characters?
That's a great question, because there's been a lot of pressure over the years from publishers and readers to do Blankets 2, basically, the sequel. Because, honestly, the books that followed Blankets, which are Carnet de Voyage and Habibi and Space Dumplings, none of those books have had the impact of Blankets. So there was always this pressure to basically do a sequel, and I always resisted. I'm like, no, I don't want to repeat myself. I don't want to exploit or ride on the coattails of a previous success. I just want to reinvent myself with each project. And this newest book, Ginseng Roots, just sort of organically ended up being a form of a sequel. And even that sort of happened reluctantly. I wasn't going to lean into the autobio in this new project. But as I got deeper into it, I realized that was the actual important story. So, maybe this is a perfect segue to talk about what Ginseng Roots is. And previous to Ginseng Roots, I've only done graphic novels. So I've only done book-length comics. And I really wanted to break that cycle. I just knew I didn't have the stamina for it again. I wanted to work in smaller bursts and get feedback from readers much more soon, get that sort of validation maybe. But also I wanted to reconnect with what comic books were to me as a kid. And as a kid, they of course were just these disposable newsstand pamphlets, that came out every month. I'm like, oh, I want a chance to do that. So with Ginseng Roots, yes, write an entire script for the whole. I had an outline for the series, and that's about it. And then I just took each issue at a time, each chapter at a time, and released it. The initial inspiration was to do a book about ginseng, which is probably best known as a medicinal herb in Chinese medicine. It's maybe wanted the plant and the root itself to be the protagonist of the series. And I was going to use it as a springboard to explore a lot of different topics. And one of those is global trade, because ginseng is the origins of the U.S.'s trade relationship with China, which becomes more and more important, every year. So before this was ever a nation, French Jesuit priests were exporting wild ginseng from the New World back to China. They knew right away that this was a lucrative herb. And then the same happened with the American Revolution, was basically funded by ginseng sales. This newly minted country owed this incredible debt to France. So one of the first things to pay off that debt was shipping basically furs and ginseng to China. And so the origins of our country is tied to this root. So I wanted to focus on the root, but when I would tell people my elevator pitch, I could see their eyes glaze over, unless, in fact, maybe they grew up with Chinese medicine and they had more of an intimate knowledge. But otherwise, there are people who are like, oh, like ginger? And I'm like, no, ginseng. And people have this very, human-centric sort of narratives that they glom onto. So I could tell people weren't that interested in the plant. So then I would say, well, I worked in ginseng as a kid from ages 10 years old to 20. I would work 40-hour weeks in my summer working in ginseng fields. in rural Wisconsin. And then people's interest was piqued. They're like, wait, what? Ginseng in Wisconsin? And what? You were like 10 years old working 40-hour weeks? So that's when I realized, like, oh, the personal story might be the even more important element of this. And I started by focusing again on my relationship with my brother, because we're the ones that did that work together. Then I learned actually from my sister that she had a very complicated relationship with the ginseng. Like, she got most traumatized by ginseng of all of us. And I must clarify that my brother and I don't think we feel traumatized by ginseng work. We were very grateful for it because we were like poor working class kids. And so working in the ginseng gave us spending money of our own. And I probably would not be working in comics if it wasn't for that spending money. So we were getting paid $1 an hour to do this work. And that translated to one comic book an hour for us. And so we were stoked. We saw it as oppressive as it kind of was. For us, it meant like we could buy comic books and then later skateboards and whatever else.
Yeah, I mean, this is a common theme we see throughout our show when we talk to storytellers, how important it is to bring in that human element, finding a way to connect with people. It's come up with so many of our creators and our storytellers just explaining how once they started writing, they realized, oh, we have to tell this personal thing. It makes it more impactful. It makes it more deep. I think it's really interesting in your work too, like you were talking about doing a serialized thing. That's a huge way a comic started, getting that immediate feedback, hearing what fans are liking, building stuff around them, learning how they're connecting. What was that experience like creating this time with this book where you are getting this immediate feedback? Tell us a little bit about storytelling in that kind of realm versus what you've done in the past.
Like, it was a little disappointing, a little bit. It wasn't as much as I wanted, because along with reader feedback, and say critical feedback in general, I was also secretly hoping that interview subjects would come out of the woodwork, and experts, that someone might like chime in and be like, oh, you got that wrong. I'm actually a scientist that does this sort of studies in this. And then they could then end up being an element of the book. Know if that happened. But as I say that out loud, I do realize that some of the relationships that stemmed out of this project, I mean, I never could have, in my wildest dreams, thought they were going to happen. It's interesting what sort of emerged organically through this process. And it did help to have like a couple of issues in print when I was going to like the Ginseng Festival in my hometown and saying, this is what I'm working on, and a business card to help some people take me seriously. Like, oh, okay, I'll sit down with an interview with you. Important parts of the book to me are in the middle, and they're the chapters that focus on Chua Vang, who's a Hmong immigrant farmer in my... I should clarify, his father was an immigrant, and he's a second generation, but he's comes from this like legacy of first generation Hmong immigrants growing ginseng. And then also there's an issue focused on Will Su, who comes from... I met with both of them a couple weeks ago. I went back to Wisconsin 2 weeks ago and reconnected with both Will and with Chua to just sort of like gather their thoughts about the series as a whole. And I talked with Will, who's one of the biggest growers in the region. Like, his family is a mega grower. By agricultural standards, you'd say they were corporate farming, but they are still a family farm. Did 2.5 days of interviews with the other major grower in my hometown. And I didn't end up using any of that footage. And I sort of realized I had a little bit of a bias because the other grower was a white farmer. And I don't think it was a conscious thing, but somehow like the immigrant story just emerged as being integral to what Ginseng Roots was. You know, like, I ended up as an author having a bias towards that. I mean, I think Chua Vang's story, Will Su's story, there was something really emotional at the heart of their family stories. And it was very much a family story that I glommed onto. But as much as it was that, it was also about the immigrant experience. So I don't know if I would have predicted that that's what this book was going to be about.
I think you make a lot of great points right here and also throughout your series. And this conversation is a great example of how this story is bringing people together in very surprising ways. It just so happens that, you know, we were in the comic book store when issue 11 came out, and that's an issue about China, about your journey there. I didn't know what I was going to expect, but it's such accurate depictions of what the country looked like and the vivid details of people's lives there. And that's what intrigued me to actually buy in the rest of the series. And as I read through it, there's just this consistent feeling of surprise of your early life as a farmer. And I think people have a perception of what America is like as a country. We talk about labels here a lot on this podcast. When you think about America, you think about New York or LA, Silicon Valley, advanced technologies and all that stuff. What people don't realize, though, is America is one of the world's top agricultural producers. Agriculture is such a huge part of this country and its economy, but depictions of the rural life and farm activity in America, in this very country, has been lacking, I think. So it's very kind of refreshing for me as I read through that. And also finding resonance and connections with my own cultural roots, because coming from China, you get very well educated on the agricultural history and culture. Even though I'm a city boy, I never really did farming myself. Those are the stories I kind of resonate with because that's what you get taught growing up. And it's very interesting for me to see how these seemingly very distant people on opposite side of the world can have such similar stories and values. And I think that's really thanks to the stories you're depicting here in Ginseng Roots.
Thank you. I mean, that's the best possible feedback I could receive. And as you were talking about it, I was just thinking, like, maybe I'm the only cartoonist who grew up working in ginseng. I'm not sure. Actually, I know I'm not the only, because in issue 7, there's an artist, Dua Shaka Her, who's among cartoonists in the same town I grew up in Wisconsin, that did a story about working in ginseng as a kid too. But we're probably the only two. But in Los Angeles, there must be plenty of storytellers that came from small rural towns, farming towns. And it is weird that there aren't more stories or depictions of farming life out there. You associate it maybe with country music and sort of right-wing politics. But the first thing that popped into mind was Minari, that movie, like a Korean American family that rural Midwest, like Arkansas, to start a farm. It reminds me a little bit of Werner Herzog's Strotzek. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but famous Herzog film about this band of weirdos from Berlin or Austria, I can't remember, who moves to rural Wisconsin to pursue the American dream. It'd be fun to watch those two movies back to back. And I have a really hard time conjuring any movies or great stories about farming right now. It's weird that it's not avoided. It's also weird that, again, it's associated with maybe right-wing politics and country music, because if you look at, Democrats, they're self-employed, they're, diverse population, like, especially now, I mean, who does farm work? It's immigrants, it's migrants, it's Mexican workers, but also over the last 100 years, it's been like, Chinese workers, and then, Filipino, and, so it's also the immigrant story. I don't know. It is interesting that it's not a story that we focus on more. Maybe it's not sexy enough for cinema, but I'd like to change that.
I think the example I've been using is Yellowstone. That's probably the big example right now that's been really taking up steam. It's still a little bit more, secession-y and mafia-esque and a little bit more fictionalized. But I think it's a huge part of the country that their story wasn't being told. And by telling stories that connect with them, you access this huge audience that's been overlooked. And it's huge with storytelling. You got to find that audience that's being underserved and find a way to super serve them.
I agree completely. I don't think I had that sort of agenda, though. I didn't deliberately try to figure out in a sort of a mercenary way of like, who's the untapped market, the way a Hollywood studio would. But yeah, I was feeling that missing. And also, you write what you know, right? I mean, I don't have a lot of experiences, but I happen to have this very weird, idiosyncratic childhood working in ginseng gardens.
I'm curious what your audience of the series has been looking like. Did a lot of urban American readers reach out to you? I wonder, what the urban population's reaction is
Oh,
to such a, farming and rural based story.
well, I think comic book readers are probably primarily urban. I
Yeah.
think it's more exciting to like get small town readers. I've done a couple events back in near my hometown too, and to have people who have never seen a comic book in their life, um, and working class people picking up a comic book because of like what we were talking about earlier, representation. Because like, whoa, this we can respond. Like we can relate to this. That's much more unique and exciting to me. But yeah, over my heart, a lot of white kids doing farm labor in America. I was maybe the last generation, but I think half of our agricultural labor done in America is children. They just are, the children of Mexican migrants and other migrants. So I think people have turned a blind eye. Will Sue talks about it in issue 9. He's like, people don't want to know where their meat comes from. They just want that meat on their plate, basically.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to know what happens on a farm. We don't want to know where our food comes from. And that's part of the major problem with the world too now is like there's not a acknowledgement of the labor and the practices that go into the things we consume.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
And I do have a little story to tell there because I know, yes, people tend to not be interested in where their food comes from. But if you're a kid growing up in China, one of the earliest poems you get taught is actually about where food comes from. It describes farmers or in the ancient times when they're harvesting at noon in a very hot day. The condition is so harsh that you have sweat literally dripping down into the soil. And at the end of the poem, it's a rhetorical question that asks, do you know that every grain of rice in your meal is harvested from extremely hard work? So
Wow.
I think, yeah, it's a very, fundamental, simple poem or, almost kid story that most, if not every Chinese kid get told. And I think that's one of the major cultural differences I notice as I come to a different country and learn about this different culture is that it's almost drilled into your head that you have a respect for the farmers, the farming population, that agriculture is such a foundation to so many of the, how our world is running because everybody needs to eat.
Yeah, it's super cool. Please send me that poem. Like
Mm-hmm.
that basically it articulates everything I've been working on for the last few years better than I could do it. Like that's profound.
Yeah, and I think your book is doing that too. Not
Thank
just
you.
the story itself, but I've also been reading the letters at the end of each issue. The way your story is able to, connect and resonate with farmers not only across the United States but across the world. I think you have letters from the Netherlands, which feels also unreal to me.
what has that meant to you? I mean, to do these autobiographical stories, to delve into your past, to really think about it, to travel, to have these discussions. How has that helped you deal with your past by kind of creating art out of it?
Well, sometimes I refer to blankets as sort of my coming out story, or I've actually heard it described that way from queer readers that they identify with blankets because for them it reflects their own coming out story. For me, it was coming out as not Christian to my very fundamentalist Christian parents. And these projects really force me to have some awkward conversations, with family in real time, that maybe I would avoid. Um, and it's not therapeutic. I can't say that making art is necessarily therapeutic. Therapy's therapeutic, that there has to be some sort of long-term benefit, certainly in terms of, I don't know, self-awareness and self-acceptance, hopefully, ultimately.
We've learned so many great stories and insights from you today, Craig. And to be mindful of your precious time, we have this closing segment called Suspenders. We ask you a fun, random question that's unrelated to anything whatsoever, and you can give us any answer you feel like.
Okay.
Question of the day is if you could have a conversation with any non-human species, which species would you choose and why? Total accident.
It's great. I mean, mushrooms is the first thing that comes to mind, but I don't know if that's a generic answer. But I do think there is something to fungus being like, and the spores of fungus maybe having to do with the origins of human consciousness. In that documentary, Fantastic Fungi, there's a theory that the sort of expansion of like the primate brain happened from ingesting probably a psychedelic mushroom. So I don't know. I think there probably is some message that fungus is in dialogue with human consciousness in some way. That's a pretty hippie answer, though.
No, it's a great answer. We love it. Thank you so much for joining us. This was super special, super insightful. We really appreciate you staying extra time as we dealt with all the technical difficulties. Really appreciate it.
Of course, my pleasure. Has been mutually expansive for me. So thank you guys.
Welcome to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we analyze and dissect some of the amazingly cool storytelling lessons we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week, we went back in time to a previous season with a previous guest, Craig Thompson. Now, welcome back to 2025. I hope you enjoyed watching that episode for the first time in video. We were never planning on releasing the video, so even if you listened to that episode when it came out, you just saw a whole new lens of pre-video LSPT pod. Kev, what was it like for you before we get into it, going back in time? What was it like for you watching our show from 2 years ago?
Yeah, it's really special, Gaurav, and a lot of mixed feelings. One, we have definitely gotten so much better at this hosting thing. Just looking at that raw footage back then, how we talked, how much we had to edit down versus how we are the most recent season. As hosts, we definitely improved, which love to see that. But even back then, as I re-listened to the first edition of this episode, I was surprised by how much I learned from that conversation all over again. And it's just this really fulfilling feeling that when you know you're creating something that you yourself enjoy and believe in, it's hard to compare.
Yeah, it's funny. Every time we do these reflection episodes, I'm reminded of how much we grow every episode, right? And I never send out our first few episodes because you can't hear us. That's my common joke. Like, the audio is bad, the editing is bad. We were going back and forth with editing. We were trying different mics. We've talked about how we're recovering perfectionists, but we're doing nothing to recover, right? It's going back to that thing we were talking about where this show was a lot about satisficing, right? This show was a lot about it's good enough, get it out, right? Because if we maximize the show, we would never got out the first episode. But the more we did it, the better we got. Obviously, it's still a fight, but every single guest, quality is the same. So it's almost like we're working hard to be worthy of the people we had in our first few episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive back into this rewind, listening back to our lessons from 2 years ago, Gaurav. What are some of your takeaways?
I'm going to go back to something I said in the first time we did this episode, is that comic book as a medium, right? This is so, so important to me as a lifelong comic book reader. And as I've gotten older, I still read some of the stuff I did as a kid, but my tastes have gotten older. I'm currently reading Saga, which is definitely an adult comic book series. Last year, I read all of the Invincible series, which is a superhero thing. And this is the thing about comic books, is It is not a genre. It is not a kiddie thing. It's not about superheroes. It is a medium. It is just another form of storytelling, like books are, like movies are, like TV are.
Yeah, and Craig's work are prime examples to the complexity or the possibilities that the medium of comic books can provide. Because as diverse the fictional or superhero genres of comic book stories can get, there is still a vibrant market of nonfiction and, in Craig's case, autobiography, memoir style type of stories that are delivered in this format. I would think of the distinction between comic books and books like the distinction with film and TV. One is not a subset of the other. They bear similar elements in the way they deliver the story. But as we said, it is a vibrant medium that contains almost endless possibilities of the types of story you can tell. And another really interesting takeaway as I re-listened to this conversation from Craig was his own self-doubt almost about even his most popular book, Blankets, at the time is this deeply personal, deeply specific story that he had at the time going to connect with a wider audience in the United States, which was vastly different from his identity tied to that story, because it talked about his very rural upbringing when the vast majority of comic book audience very urban, but people connected with Blankets nonetheless because there were still relatable themes in his story about coming of age, about first love, family, relationship with faith and falling out of faith, as he said. Those are highly relatable. And it's as Craig said, when you go as specific as possible with your story, it almost becomes universal again. And it is through telling the deeply personal aspects of your story, even with Ginseng Roots. Those are the things that connect with people, that attract the audience, was authentic and personal and true to you, which is obviously something we've talked repeatedly on this show.
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes to this idea we talk about a lot about how stories can educate, right? There's some obvious ways. Like as a kid growing up in Canada, I learned a lot about American government from The West Wing, and a little bit more as I got older from Hamilton, right? Romanticized a little bit. But
yeah, but that's how you start, right?
That's how you
to
start.
go deeper.
Exactly. In Ginseng Roots, you learn things about trade. You learn things about the culture. Like, I'm not going to have the experience where I go to this part of the world where ginseng is grown. Not everyone gets that opportunity. So through stories, you learn about trade. You learn about cultures. You learn about how this all works. And even though that's not the primary purpose, it helps people learn. And that's the beauty of storytelling. It's a way that builds empathy with one another. And this is a deeply personal, very specific story, but allows you to learn about all these really big, universal feelings because you can relate to that story. You can apply it to yourself. You can see the art. You can see the emotions. And we've seen this time and time again. Comes to mind is Carrie's son. We interviewed her since this episode came out, and Carrie's son wrote this autobiography of her journey through working at this big firm as an assistant. And it's funny because we don't read a lot of books about the assistant's point of view. And she narrated it herself. We listened to the audiobook on Spotify. I remember I was in New York a lot for work, listening to this as walking through the streets of New York. I learned a little bit more about her story. I was able to build more empathy. And there's some universal elements of that we can all learn from. And this is the thing about autobiographies that is so powerful. And even if you're not going to write one to publish, you can look back at your life as a story where you're the main character energy, and you can try to write it to see, oh, that's why I had to go through that. Or I'm so glad there was ups and downs because it made my story more interesting. And to be clear, it's really hard to do. It requires you to sit down, write out, this is why I made this decision, this is why this happened, this is why I couldn't do this in the moment. And that's really, really hard. But sometimes doing that work, looking at your life as a story can help you see, oh, that just made it more interesting.
Yeah, and even though not all of us are going to be writers or comic book artists, we are constantly telling our own stories when we talk to other people. And the day-to-day conversations, big and small. And it's important to remember that the stories you have already are very interesting, that people will find fascinating when you understand the value in your own story and tell it in a compelling way. And we see this in Craig's stories, in a lot of his own work. And who knows, we might end up finding unexpected connections with people because of the ways we connect with each other's stories, the way we did with Craig this time. For those of you who are deeply interested in this conversation, make sure to check out Ginseng Roots. Again, the graphic novel is available wherever you can find a comic book store. So go check it out. But
But wait,
otherwise,
Kevin, how many did they send us?
there's actually quite a few.
They
And
sent
there's
us.
only two of
Oh,
us.
there's only two of us, so I think they sent us 4. I think maybe we should give away a couple. Let's send it out. We're gonna give away 2 copies of Ginseng Roots. To enter, all you have to do is leave a review and rating on Spotify and or Apple Podcasts. You can get 2 entries if you leave a review on both platforms. All you have to do is once you leave the review, take a screenshot, follow us on Instagram, and send us a message. So step 1, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and or Spotify. Step 2, follow us on Instagram. And step 3, send us a screenshot and you'll be entered to win.
Yeah, it's a win-win-win offer, y'all. You get to enjoy amazing stories like Craig's Ginseng Roots. You help us grow our show. We obviously will benefit a lot from that. And of course, we all help Craig spreading the words around about the graphic novel. So make sure to follow us on Instagram at LSPTpod, also TikTok, LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie. Leave a comment, leave a review everywhere you listen.
And subscribe on YouTube. We're on YouTube this season.
And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening and watching.